I'm Candace Morgan, a doctoral student at the College of Social Work at University of South Carolina, and we are very honored today to talk to Carla Damron. Carla is a native of South Carolina. She's practiced social work in this state for 31 years. She has served on the advisory committee for USC School of Rehab Counseling. She has worked for various community mental health centers and the State Office of Department of Mental Health. She is currently the Executive Director for the National Association of Social Workers, South Carolina chapter. Her areas of interest are comprehensive and progressive services for adults with serious mental illness, and in her role as the National Association of Social Worker Executive Director in South Carolina, she is focusing on advocacy, such as with human trafficking and voter suppression. So we're delighted that Carla has agreed to talk with us about her experiences as a social worker in South Carolina. So Carla, let me start by asking you to share your thoughts about why social workers need to know something about the history, culture, and shared experiences of South Carolinians. And please share anything about South Carolina culture you think a social worker needs to know.
South Carolina is a unique state, and I think it's important that we understand the history pretty comprehensively if we're going to be able to figure it out, if we're able to figure out what social problems we're dealing with right now and why we're kind of in the mess that we're in, and I feel like we are kind of in a mess. When you mentioned this subject, the first place my mind went to was the whole civil rights movement in the 60s and how South Carolina responded to that. And I'm thinking about my practice and working with adults that had lived through the civil rights era and how that affected them. And I think it's important because I think that race is still a pretty important issue today in politics. If you look at when President Obama was elected, I saw on the faces of people that are Caucasian that I have loved and respected a look of terror because they had a president for the first time that did not look like them, especially if you were a Caucasian man, and we'd always had Caucasian men for presidents. And so now we have an African-American man with a funny name who's our president. It was like, I needed to remember that there's still a seed of discomfort in white people like me. There's still a seed there. And I think it's important that all of us kind of know that history. If you are working with an adult that's my age, which is an older adult, I hate to say it, but anyway, if you're working with an older adult that was alive back when there were separate bathrooms, when there were separate water fountains, when the rules were actually different, the laws were actually different for two different groups of human beings. One set of human beings had these laws, and another set of human beings had these laws. That's pretty bizarre when you think back on it, but that's how it was. In my hometown, which was Sumter, the African-American community was actually the majority. 60% of Sumter at that time was African-American, but they were the minority. So you have a minority that's a majority. This is very, very interesting. So in my later work as a social worker, I found that if I was working with an African-American client who was in their 50s or 60s, they might defer to me more. They might treat me with ultra respect and politeness, and may not feel comfortable divulging a lot of what their personal truth is, because I'm of that different race, and and I needed to understand that I would have to probe a little differently to develop a stronger relationship before there would be that level of trust, and they had a lot of reason to mistrust given the history. So, and the same token, when you're dealing with the children raised by that generation, they were affected as well. They may have seen their mom be treated poorly and have anger about that. So we just need to be respectful of that that's the history. Then on the other side of it, you have people that felt entitled to a lot that later lost some of their entitlement when these laws changed. And that caused some anger and resentment in the Caucasian community. I think there's still some there. I think it's suppressed. I think it's pushed down. I think some of it might be bubbling up now, kind of in some of the political stuff that you see. But So yeah, that's kind of an important part of our history that we need to see. South Carolina in the 60s was very, very volatile. 60s and very early 70s was very volatile. It's a volatile time, an important time. Really powerful changes happened, but we're still feeling it. When I was in the state office, one of my state office for the Department of Mental Health, I visited, I think, just about every town in South Carolina to see how different services were provided to adults with serious mental illness, and boy, there was a range. In the more urban settings, we tended to be more not institutional, but we had large programs that were in office buildings. Mm-hmm. In the smaller communities, they'd be in houses, so they had a more homey feel, which was kind of neat. Mm-hmm. But the other thing I had to be aware of was just the difference in resources from one area to another. I remember going to Batesburg, South Carolina. I think it was Batesburg, which is a tiny little place. And they had a lovely little program for adults with mental illness in a house. And it was, they served home-cooked meals every day. The clients came in by Medicaid transportation. The Medicaid contract was given to the funeral home. So the clients arrived every day to work in a limousine. Very different to the vans that the urban areas use that were marked. When you got on that van, you were on the short bus. To me, it was very stigmatizing. These folks arrived in a limousine, which I thought was very, very cool. Okay. That's kind of an interesting thing, but take it kind of to the other extreme. I went to, and I would like to say that my experience should have prepared me for this, but I was being ignorant. I wasn't using my experience. I went to Allendale, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And going to Allendale, South Carolina it's like another country from here. I like to, there are places like Allendale that in some ways are third world countries. I mean, I almost have to see it that way. So I go there and it's like incredibly poor. The school systems are in horrible shape. The Justice Department came in at one point because this is an African American community that still does not have the resources that Lexington County does. So still, it's still struggling. It's still trying to build itself. The unemployment rate is very high, and you think, well, why did the people stay here? Why don't they leave? Well, this is home. They want to stay there. But the resources haven't trickled down to Allendale. And so you have to kind of have a different perspective when you're there. You can't bring a progressive approach to a place that has had very little access to progress in some ways. So that was kind of interesting. I feel like you have to remember Allendale. You need to go visit Allendale. You need to visit places like that are just so far behind and are trying to catch up. There's a big, strong spirit in that community, but they're not there yet. At least they weren't when I was there. A client that I had, and this was it was a different kind of moment, but it was important. I had a client that was a young woman. She's in her 20s. I think she had like a 7th grade education, lived in a rural situation. She was on a farm, I think, with her husband, very poor. And she was clearly hallucinating. Her first step into the mental health center was her first step in treatment, and clearly she had some kind of psychotic disorder. And we put her on medication to help her with psychosis, and she wouldn't take it. And so I was young clinician, and that was very frustrating to me because certainly I knew what was best for her, and she must be unhappy having these voices screaming in her head. And she confided in me that her minister had told her that she shouldn't take the medicine. And she would belong to one of these fringe, small, independent churches that they didn't believe in taking medicine. And I found myself having a power struggle. I felt like I should have more influence over her than this minister. And so, well, your minister's wrong. You need to take some medicine, blah, 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 blah. And she came to see me the following week, and she still had not taken her medicine. And she said that she was actually in church and felt the devil jump on her back. And she had run from the church. And I was like, this is terrible. I said, you're in a lot of pain. I think this medicine would help you. And she said, no, you don't understand. Other people saw it too. Other people in the church had seen the devil on her back. Yeah. So that told me that, one, the the support system she had also supported her illness.
Sure.
But two, just the power of that church and that minister, that pastor in her life. I'm an Episcopalian. The minister is someone that I see when someone dies. It's a very, we don't have this close relationship with the pastor.
No.
But this man had a direct influence on everything about her.
Sure.
And that was really important. And I could try to go up against him in that power, but it was not going to be effective. So I learned a really important lesson to be respectful of people's religious beliefs, even if they're dramatically different than mine. Eventually, this woman did wind up going to the hospital. And my guess is I kind of lost track of her after that because she was in the hospital a long time and I wound up leaving. But my guess is when she returned to that home community, she returned to that church and the same struggle would have continued. I did actually mention that I would like to meet the minister, and I think that might have been a way to go, to have the minister come and join me in a session to see if there would be any wiggle room in his philosophy and his beliefs. But the power of religion in the South is amazing, and you just need to understand that when you're assessing someone as a clinician, you need to assess that as well. We talk a lot about using spirituality, later in treatment, that became a big issue that you talked about spirituality, but I would say you go into pretty great detail about that. Churches can be an incredible source of support, especially if you're in an area where the resources are limited.
Sure.
The church might be where you go for a lot of things. So how was that helpful to you and how was it not? I would say, a social worker moving into the state is going to be pretty frustrated, I think, when you look at the social issues that we face and the direction that our government is taking. I find myself a little frustrated when you look at we're rejecting funding for Medicaid that would help, that we're already paying for, but the state is rejecting it. When it's proven that states that actually take this funding have a 6% reduction in mortality rate. So that's kind of intriguing. You would reject something that would keep people from dying. If I think any social worker who deals with something like that is going to go, what? How could that be? Well, if you think about, you need to understand South Carolina in terms of its history. We have always been weird.
Yes.
We seceded from the Union before. We were the first state to do that. We seceded from the Union because of the slavery issue. But it was more than that. It was also the idea that the federal government would impose rules on us, that we weren't allowed to make our own rules. That spirit is still here in South Carolina. And the whole Tea Party movement is all about that. So when we see us rejecting something that would be good for us, we're being loyal to who we are as South Carolina, the weird state.
That's a great point.
We just have to know that. We don't really like people coming in and telling us what to do. On the other hand, I think the people in government do care about the people of South Carolina. So there are things that happen that are progressive, like we did get the human trafficking bill passed, which is awesome. We got that passed. It's amazing. But on the other hand, there are other things that we haven't been able to make headway on. So we just have to understand that that's kind of part of who we are, and why, when I talked about the civil rights era, things had to be forced into South Carolina for the change to happen. We would have stayed segregated if that hadn't been forced on us. But boy, did it create a lot of anger and fervor and tumult, and because sometimes we don't do things that are good for us without that intervention. So I think that's one thing you have to understand. So if you may look at things and go, this makes no sense, this is totally illogical, why is the government going this way? Why would it be? It's like, well, we're respecting our right to be independent and make decisions for ourselves as a state, either even if they're not good for us or not good for a lot of the citizens. The other side of it is you do see a pretty strong class issue right now in South Carolina. With the economy as it is, we're dichotomized. There are a lot of very, very poor people, and there's still a lot of very, very wealthy people. And the very, very wealthy people tend to be Caucasian. The very, very poor people tend to be African American. And so there you have it. I would like to just put them on a bus and take them lots of places.
Okay.
I would like to take them to Spoleto in Charleston.
Okay.
Because Spoleto is an amazing arts festival that South Carolina has every year. It's amazing that South Carolina does like that. I just think that's so you have that which is a source of just amazing beauty to me. And then I would want to go to Allendale and see where there are no resources. I'd want to go and show them the private schools that sprung up when desegregation happened, the white flight. This school exists because the parents of children did not want their children to be desegregated. Wow. You build a school just to keep your child from having to be in a classroom with an African American child. Wow. But they're there and they're still here. They're now integrated. I think every one of those private schools is now integrated. But when you go back to why they existed, that was why. So where else would I want to go? I'd probably want to go take them to a couple of cotton fields to imagine what it was like to have to pick cotton for a living, because that was pretty wretched work. But it had to be done. So yeah. I think that it's a challenge to be a social worker in South Carolina. There's always important issues that we need to address that are difficult to address. They're difficult to address in progressive states, but they can be more difficult to address here because we sometimes shoot ourselves in the foot as a state. But I do believe that there's a core goodness in people, and there's a core goodness in the people of South Carolina, and there's a lot of strength in the people of South Carolina. A lot of stubbornness, but there's a lot of strength. And I think you just kind of have to tap into that. Even in government, even when government is making crazy decisions, they're basically good people in there. So you have to just kind of understand what their thinking is that makes them want to make the decisions that they're making. Because they're basically good people, and they basically care about their state and the citizens of their state. If their thinking or their argument's a little askew, you just need to kind of understand that and try to get down to why they're the basic goodness that's there. The anti-bullying bill that we worked on last year, we were not successful with that bill, but the concern about the reason that it didn't pass was concern about language in the bill about protecting children from being accused of being gay. They didn't want that language in there, and one of the reasons was, I think one of the reasons was we don't want to mention gay because we don't want it to be seen that that's okay. Well, okay, it is okay, but let's say you're, gay children are at high risk for suicide. Oh, okay, then maybe we do need to mention that. The next thing that came up was, but let's say they have to have interventional counseling. Oh, okay, so you want to cure children of being gay. And this was an actual legislator, and no, that's not right either. But imagine that your child is a victim of bullying and accused of being gay when they're not. Or imagine your child is just beside someone who's being bullied and gets hurt. Or imagine that your child is struggling with this. And then we saw concerned fathers. We saw, I would not want my child. So the concerned father was there. Mm-hmm. It was all this ideology about the gay is wrong or whatever that was, that was covering it and that kept surfacing as an issue. But when you get down to it, there was a concerned father or the concerned uncle that didn't want any kid to get hurt. Mm-hmm. We still didn't get that legislation passed. We need to try again next year. That's what we have to tap into. And not bring your own agenda. That's the thing I struggle with. Yeah. I could easily bring my agenda, very easily, bring my agenda into anything. Sure. But if I do that, I'm less likely to listen and I'm less likely to look beneath the layers to see what's really going on. So I need to kind of put that aside and try to relate human to human, agenda-free, human to human to really understand. I think if I was asked myself to violate the code of ethics, I would have to leave. Okay. But because Sure. But on the other hand, if you can approach it, like I said before, about that this is a third world country. Mm-hmm. So I want everybody to be up here. I want everybody to have this view of equality and that we're all the same. I want all of us to believe this. But I find I'm with people that are here. Mm-hmm. So I can say, well, I can't relate to you guys because y'all are down here and I'm leaving. Right. Or I can say, I'm going to do everything I can to help you get to here. But it is approaching it like, okay, I'm going to take you guys where you are. Yeah. I am not going to go where you are. Right. I'm not going to start spouting this stuff off. I'm not going to do that. But I'm going to be an example to you of someone that thinks differently, feels differently, has a different perspective, and hope that I can develop enough of a relationship with you that maybe you can listen to me.
Yeah.
So, but it's a different approach. It's like, you know, I'm here to insert an idea to you guys that you have so far rejected. And I'm going to see if I can find a way to make that idea meaningful for you. I may succeed or I may not. So, you know, living by an example that I'm going to treat people with fairness and with equality and all of that. I was working with my goddaughter who's in med school, and she's working in a rural community. And there's a lot of attitudes among the professional staff about people with mental illness. They're all, oh, she's faking it, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, you know, you can buy into that approach and, you know, be like them, or you can bring a fresh perspective and say, no, she's not. I think she's really suffering. You know, it's easy to put her in that category that, you know, she's just here for attention, blah, 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 blah. Or you can bring a different perspective to them that, you know, maybe they had it one time and lost, they're just kind of jaded now. You can bring that to them. So we have to kind of have that same approach, that I'm going to be an example of something that's different than what you and this agency culture is right now. And you do see that. You see cultures, agency cultures that are pretty far behind. When I mentioned Allendale, when I went to a meeting there was a huge racial dichotomy in this meeting. It was actually being hosted by some board members who were African American, but they had very little to say in the meeting. They served food. They were polite. They were cordial. We were on their turf. But when the Caucasian male director was there, he took control of the meeting, and their opinion wasn't even sought. It was like, wow, you know, it's like we were on their lane, we were in their space. Let's hear what they're about. But there was no real place for that, nor did they have the expectation that they would have a voice in that meeting. I thought that was very interesting.